The white plastic digital room key for the casino resort sat on the center of my father's desk, its magnetic strip scratched and worn from 2 years of quiet mileage. It was a cheap piece of plastic, but it carried the exact weight of a multi-million-dollar lie. "Look at me when I'm speaking to you, Valerie," my father said. His voice was too loud for the small office, a heavy, performative roar that used to make me jump when I was a kid. He slammed his fist down on the desk, right next to the key, making the glass coffee mug rattle. "You failed this family the second you let your ego interfere with this business. You're an employee here, nothing more, and I am letting you go. Pack your things and get out of my building." My mother stood by the window, her arms crossed tightly over her silk blouse. She didn't even blink. She just stared at the rainy warehouse lot outside and whispered, "Leave, Valerie. We don't need you anymore." I didn't scream. I didn't cry. My hands stayed loose and perfectly still at my sides. They looked at my quietness and saw defeat. They thought they were discarding a broken daughter who had spent too many years analyzing dirty ledgers in combat zones. They saw a liability. What they didn't see, what they couldn't possibly comprehend through the fog of their own arrogance, was the digital dashboard currently open on my phone inside my pocket. They didn't realize that every major supplier account, every commercial fuel card, and every single line of credit that kept Donovan Development from collapsing into bankruptcy was legally backed by my personal social security number and my veteran bookkeeping license. 2 years ago, they had begged me on their knees to sign those forms when their bank rejected them. Now, they genuinely believed they owned the air I breathed. I looked at my father's red, triumphant face, then at my mother's cold profile. The silence in the room stretched until it felt heavy enough to snap. I reached into my coat pocket, my thumb finding the smooth glass screen of my phone. With 2 precise taps, I accessed the administrative portal and placed a permanent, total fraud freeze on every single corporate card and credit line bearing my guarantee. I picked up my briefcase, turned my back on them, and walked toward the door. I didn't look back to see their expressions. I knew the exact timing of the system. As my hand touched the aluminum door handle, my phone vibrated once against my palm. It wasn't a call from them. It was an automated network alert from the bank's compliance division, a cold notification that the dominoes had officially begun to fall. I opened the door, stepped out into the damp, gray Cleveland air, and muttered to the empty hallway, "Let's see how long the infrastructure stands when you pull out the foundation." The automatic text alert from the banking system vanished from my screen, replaced by the digital clock on my dashboard. It was 5:42 p.m. The cold, heavy rain kept hitting the roof of my sedan in erratic bursts, sounding like gravel thrown against metal. I sat there with my hands still resting on the top of the steering wheel, watching the high, arched windows of the Donovan estate glow with a warm, deceptive light across the asphalt. From the outside, everything looked perfectly normal. It looked like a successful family sitting down to an early dinner after a productive day at the office. But the reality was already shifting in the dark. My phone started vibrating in the plastic cup holder. It didn't just ring, it buzzed with a frantic, desperate energy that made it slide an inch across the console. The screen lit up with my father's corporate number. 5 seconds later, it dropped to voicemail, only for the screen to immediately flash with my mother's private line. Then came the main office line for Donovan Development. Then an unknown number from a local exchange, likely one of his framing subcontractors standing at a commercial lumber counter with a flatbed full of unpaid structural timber and a declined piece of plastic. I didn't answer. I just watched my breath fog the side window, then wiped it clear with the edge of my sleeve. For a second, a dangerous kind of muscle memory tried to take over my arms. I could feel the old, exhausting urge to pull the car back into the driveway, walk through the front door, and start translating their anger into something manageable. That had been my self-assigned role for as long as I could remember. I was the one who fixed the broken ledgers before the credit bureaus noticed. I was the professional stabilizer, the daughter who kept the family's chaotic relationship with money looking respectable from the outside. When you spend 2 years in a military intelligence unit tracking illicit supply lines through the dust of Kandahar, you develop a bad habit of thinking you can manage any structural crisis. You get used to compartmentalizing the panic around you. When the baseline credit facility for Donovan Development almost dissolved 2 years ago, They had come to me with trembling hands, speaking in the urgent, fragile language of family survival. They said it was a temporary fix. They said my clean credit rating and veteran bookkeeping profile would simply act as a legal bridge until the spring contracts cleared. Instead, they turned my name into a permanent corporate shield. Every paint order, every diesel fuel delivery, every high-end client lunch, and once, a long weekend trip to an upscale resort casino that my father insisted was an essential development meeting. It all ran on my personal guarantee. I had become their human safety net, an administrative resource they used without thinking, right up until the moment I asked to see the matching revenue sheets. The phone thrummed against the plastic console again, a low, insect-like sound that seemed to fill the cramped interior of the car. A text preview popped up from my mother. "Come back inside immediately, Valerie. Your father's crew is waiting on the morning drywall delivery. Don't do this to him." The phrasing made me let out a short, dry laugh that sounded strange even to me. It was classic Alina. Even with the financial foundation of the company cracking, her primary instinct wasn't to look at the numbers. It was to protect the theatrical performance of Arthur Donovan's authority in front of his workmen. Then a different name flashed across the screen. Leo, my 22-year-old brother, didn't call. He sent a single line, "Dad is tearing the office apart. He says you did this to destroy him. What's going on, Val?" I stared at the text until the screen dimmed into blackness. The anger that had carried me out of the building started to cool, leaving behind a heavy, metallic taste of consequence. I hadn't just set a boundary. I had left my brother inside the blast zone of our father's rage. Leo worked part-time for the concrete division while trying to finish his classes at the community college. His tuition payments, his truck keys, his bedroom, they were all line items controlled by Arthur's moods. I shifted the sedan into drive, the transmission engaging with a slight, mechanical shudder. I couldn't stay parked on the curb waiting for my father to walk down the driveway with a flashlight. I pulled away from the stone gates of the estate and headed west, toward the older, blue-collar section of the city where my maternal aunt, Evelyn, lived in a brick townhouse sandwiched between a strip mall and a retired tool-and-die shop. The drive wasn't cinematic. There were no long, reflective stretches of open highway to soften the weight of what I had just done. There were only wet, neon-stained streets, the rhythmic, deafening slap of worn wiper blades, and the harsh glare of brake lights reflecting off the pooling water in the ruts of the asphalt. Every red light felt like an interrogation. Was I finally protecting my professional existence, or was I simply becoming the kind of person who used financial leverage as a blunt weapon to punish people? I didn't have a clean, sophisticated answer for myself as I turned down Evelyn Street. I only knew that my name was the only piece of property I had left that night, and I couldn't let them run it into the dirt just to maintain an illusion of wealth. When I reached the townhouse, Aunt Evelyn was already standing under the small porch light, her old wool cardigan pulled tight against the wind. She didn't look surprised. She looked like a woman who had spent 30 years transcribing court records and had been expecting this specific document to drop for a generation. She stepped aside to let me pass through the door, her voice level and entirely devoid of dramatic sentiment. "Come inside, Valerie," she said, locking the deadbolt behind me with a heavy, distinct click. "Before you talk yourself into turning that car around." Aunt Evelyn's living room smelled of dried mint, old newspaper print, and the faint, bitter residue of the lemon oil she used to polish her oak furniture. It was a narrow, quiet space. A single floor lamp cast a low, amber pool of light across two laptops sitting open on the dining table, their cooling fans whirring a soft, constant note that filled the silence. I set my briefcase down on the chair. My phone hummed against my thigh, 3 short vibrations in quick succession. "Put it down, Valerie," Evelyn said. She didn't look up from her monitor. Her reading glasses sat low on her nose, held by a thin silver chain that clicked against her collarbone as she moved. "Not off, just down. Let them make their noise where you don't have to carry it." I pulled the phone from my trench coat and placed its screen down beside a white ceramic bowl filled with oranges. The wood of the table was cold. Within 10 seconds, the device buzzed again, sliding a fraction of an inch across the varnished grain. We both watched it. It looked like a trapped insect trying to find an exit. "How many lines?" she asked. 6, I said. My voice sounded flat, dry from the drafty air of the car. 3 primary commercial accounts, 2 fuel cards for the trucks, and the emergency backup card Alina keeps in her purse like a personal checking line. Are you legally clear to freeze them? I'm the primary guarantor. My social security number is the anchor. I didn't touch their personal checking or the active payroll account. Evelyn nodded once, her jaw tightening. Good. Don't let your anger make you sloppy. Arthur thrives when people get sloppy around him. She stood up, her faded green cardigan dragging slightly against the back of her chair, and walked into the small kitchen area to put the kettle on the stove. She was a retired family court stenographer. For 30 years, she had sat in the well of the court, her fingers recording the exact, unvarnished vocabulary of domestic ruin. She had watched families dismantle their own structures over a signature, a bad loan, or a verbal promise that looked perfectly safe right up until the bank underwriters got involved. She knew the mechanics of leverage. I sat down in the empty chair, my fingers resting on the laptop trackpad. I opened my professional bookkeeping dashboard, intending to pull the historical activity logs for Donovan Development. I needed to ensure my personal license was protected before the morning banking hours opened. The screen flickered. A red dialog box popped up over the interface. Access DE&IED, account under administrative review. I stared at the text. My skin went cold beneath my damp shirt. A standard administrative flag on a bookkeeping license takes weeks of bureaucratic processing. It doesn't trigger at midnight on a Thursday. Evelyn, I said. She walked back into the room holding 2 heavy ceramic mugs of black tea. She set them down, leaned over my shoulder, and looked at the red warning box. Her index finger reached out, tapping the lower left corner of the monitor where a sequence of raw system exception codes blinked in gray text. "That's a manual override," she whispered. Her voice lost its detached, professional calmness. That didn't come from the licensing board's automated compliance queue. Someone with regional administrative access pulled your specific file and locked your authentication keys from the top down. I didn't answer. I opened a secondary browser window, typing in the secure address for the Department of Veterans Affairs database. I needed my unclassified deployment records, the psychological stability metrics from my discharge physicals that would instantly disprove the narrative my mother was currently spinning to the family network. The spinning icon dragged on for 30 seconds, then the interface broke. Record restricted. Citation, Regional Hold Issuing Authority Archive. The kitchen was dead silent except for the sudden, sharp whistle of the kettle on the stove. I didn't move. My mind went directly back to the logistical briefing rooms in Kandahar, the smell of dust-choked air conditioning and scorched wiring. In the intelligence wings, a sudden blackout of your local tracking assets didn't mean the system was broken. It meant you had accidentally tripped a wire close to a high-value target. Arthur Donovan was an influential regional builder in Northeast Ohio, but he didn't possess the security clearance or the federal reach required to lock a military service file. I minimized the windows, accessing the local cached drive where my master backup logs were stored. I began running a deep packet analysis on the historical transaction history of the Vanguard Tri-State accounts, the unrecognized shell company that had been draining thousands from my credit lines. My fingers moved across the keys, the sound sharp and rhythmic in the quiet house. I cross-referenced the disbursement dates with the public municipal ledger on Evelyn's second screen. Every single time Donovan Development won a non-competitive public contract from the city council, including the multi-million-dollar Miller High School pour, a corresponding cash-equivalent transfer went to Vanguard Tri-State 48 hours prior. And the authorization routing numbers didn't come from my father's office. They mapped back to a secure wireless node inside the VIP lounge of the resort casino, where Judge Harrison Vance held his private judicial fundraisers. The mystery of my locked files wasn't a family problem anymore. It was an institutional shield. My father hadn't just used my name to buy drywall. He had used my military intelligence credentials as the blind pipeline for a local political bribery ring. Evelyn sat down slowly, her tea untouched as she stared at the overlapping dates on the monitors. "They don't want you to apologize, Valerie," she said, her voice dropping into a hard, defensive whisper. "They need to erase your access before the bank's automated underwriters pull the physical tapes on Monday morning. The phone on the table stopped vibrating. The text alerts cut out. A second later, the screen lit up with a solid, continuous amber glow. The caller ID didn't show a name. It displayed a restricted local exchange from the downtown municipal building. Evelyn reached across the table, her hand catching my wrist. "Don't pick it up." I looked at her, then down at the glass screen. My heart rate stayed perfectly flat. I pulled my wrist free, swiped the green interface, and set the phone directly beside the bowl of oranges on speaker. I didn't say a word. I let the line hold the silence. For 5 seconds, there was nothing but the hollow, digital hiss of an encrypted patch. Then, a low, controlled voice filled the kitchen, smooth, professional, and entirely devoid of my father's raw, clumsy anger. "Miss Donovan," the voice said, "your service record in Kandahar was exemplary. It would be a profound tragedy if your current domestic difficulties resulted in a permanent blemish on your professional standing. The state licensing board is a very small circle. The regional federal judiciary is even smaller." I watched a drop of condensation run down the side of my tea mug. "Identify yourself," I said. "Consider me a friend of the local infrastructure," the voice replied. "Unlock the primary corporate lines by 8:00 a.m. tomorrow. If you do, your credentials will be restored by noon, your VA archive will be cleared, and your father's business will settle your guarantee through a private restructuring. If you choose to ignore this window, you will find that a restricted record makes it exceptionally difficult to find safety anywhere in this state. Sleep well." The line clicked dead. The silence returned, heavy and smelling of old paper. I reached out, flipped the phone back over, and looked at my reflection in the dark glass. The spring inside me didn't snap. It just locked into place. The digital clock in the corner of my terminal blinked to 2:13 a.m. Outside, the freezing sleet had intensified, hitting the window pane like a handful of loose gravel thrown against the glass over and over. The small kitchen had grown cold. The sharp, clean scent of the oranges in the ceramic bowl seemed to sharpen in the damp air, contrasting with the stale, metallic smell of the hard drive fan exhausting warm air against my wrists. The phone on the table stayed quiet now, but the screen kept flashing a pale amber every time another automated network notification stacked onto the lock screen. The system was hemorrhaging data on their end, and the automated triggers I had set up before leaving Kandahar were doing exactly what they were built to do. "He's not going to wait for Monday, Valerie," Aunt Evelyn said. She walked back into the kitchen, her house slippers scuffing softly against the worn linoleum. She set a fresh bowl of hot water on the table and sat down, pulling her faded green folder onto her lap. "Vance knows the exact timeline of a federal bank audit. If he signs that emergency injunction in chambers tomorrow morning without a docket number, Arthur's couriers will hand it to the corporate suppliers by noon. They'll bypass your freeze by calling it an issue of regional security." "He can't clear the metadata, Evelyn," I said. My voice was low, rhythmic, holding the flat cadence of a tactical radio log. "He can lock my state license file from a remote terminal, but he can't delete the physical routing headers on the casino transactions. The data is already cached on my local hard drive." I leaned closer to the monitor. My eyes tracked the scrolling columns of hexadecimal code. To an untrained eye, the black screen was just a wall of digital noise. To me, it was a map of a fortress. When you spend 2 deployments tracking the underground financial pipelines of insurgent cells through Helmand and Kandahar, you learn that corruption has a predictable biological rhythm. The numbers always move when the power structures feel safe. I traced the Vanguard tri-state transaction string back 24 months. The pattern was brutal in its simplicity. Every single time Donovan Development won a non-competitive municipal concrete contract from the Regional Development Board, a corresponding hospitality disbursement cleared my personal credit line exactly 48 hours prior. I pulled up the Public City Council archive on Evelyn's secondary monitor, cross-referencing the dates. November 14, 2024, Donovan Development wins the foundational pour for the new county athletic complex. November 12, 2024, A $12,000 cash equivalent withdrawal is authorized on my primary business card at an automated teller machine located inside the VIP lounge of the Jack Casino downtown. The physical IP address didn't match my father's residential office or his warehouse. It belonged to a secure, encrypted node assigned to the private judicial suites used by Judge Harrison Vance during his annual fundraising dinners. Arthur hadn't just turned me into an emergency fund with a pulse. He had turned my military identity, my clean veteran credit profile, and my professional license into a blind laundry machine for local political kickbacks. He was the concrete, Vance was the law, and I was the unflagged infrastructure carrying the dirt between them. The validation gap didn't just narrow, it turned into a solid piece of evidence. The anonymous clerk who had called my phone 10 minutes ago wasn't making a threat based on a legal filing. He was panicking because the financial foundation of their entire regional machine was currently locked inside a frozen master account bearing my name. It's a structural feedback loop, I muttered, my fingers tapping 3 keys to lock the local archive into an encrypted partition. If the lines stay frozen through the weekend, the bank's federal underwriters automatically pull the transaction history for a standard manual review. Vance's signature on those municipal permits will collide directly with the casino withdrawals on my statement. Evelyn watched the numbers scroll past, the blue light of the terminal catching the deep, permanent lines around her mouth. They aren't trying to scare you into compliance anymore, Val. They are trying to erase your standing before the federal inspectors look at the ledger. The phone on the table went completely dark for 3 seconds. Then, it delivered a short, violent double vibration against the oak wood. It wasn't the restricted municipal number this time. It wasn't my father's corporate line or my mother's frantic texts. The sender ID was Leo. I flipped the phone over, my thumb pressing the glass. The internal monologue that usually kept my observations detached went cold. Dad found my summer enrollment forms on the office printer. He took my truck keys off the counter. He says if I don't get you to drop the credit blocks by morning, I'm out of the family and off the payroll. Val, he's losing it. He threw a heavy commercial tape measure through the drywall in the upper hallway right next to my head. The masonry crews are parked in the driveway right now blowing their horns because their fuel cards were declined at the Sunoco station. What did you do? I stood up, the movement so abrupt my wooden chair scraped hard against the floorboards. The adrenaline hit my chest like a physical weight. It was the classic tactical redirection of a cornered target. When an abuser hits an ironclad, unyielding perimeter, the system automatically shifts its pressure to the weakest remaining node in the domestic network. Leo was 22, but he was still financially anchored to Arthur's infrastructure. His tuition, his vehicle, his income, they were all leverage points Arthur used to guarantee absolute compliance. Valerie, Evelyn said, her voice sharp as she stood up from her chair, her green cardigan catching on the armrest. Look at me. I didn't look at her. I was already tracking the distance between the west side of Cleveland and the estate in the rain. I could hear my mother's voice from my childhood, the old, rhythmic conditioning trying to pull my hands back to the keyboard. Just unlock one card, Valerie. Apologize to your father so everyone can sleep. Be the daughter who absorbs the damage so the house stays quiet. Valerie, stop, Evelyn commanded, her hand closing firmly over my wrist. Her grip was surprisingly cold, steady. Don't you start speaking their language just because they found a way to make it loud. A hostage exchange only works if you give up your weapon. The second you do, they crush both of you anyway. I took a slow, deep breath, expanding my lungs against the internal static until my heart rate flattened back into the clinical zone. I dialed Leo's number. He answered on the first ring, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps through the receiver. In the background, I could hear the hollow, echoing drumming of the rain against the sheet metal roof of the detached garage. Leo, I said, my voice dropping into the level drone of an intelligence briefing. Give me your exact status. The garage, he whispered, his voice cracking. I'm wedged behind the commercial tile pallets near the back bay door. He's inside the main house screaming at Mom. The flatbeds are blocking the driveway, Val. They can't move the equipment. Everyone is texting me asking if you're dangerous. Listen to me, Leo, I said, my hand flattening against the briefcase on the table. Leave your gear, put your boots on. Watch the wood line at the edge of the property. I am coming to get you." I hung up, grabbed the manila folder from the desk, and slid my arms into my trench coat. Evelyn was already at the front door, her keys jingling in her hand, her face set in a hard, defensive line. "Let's go," she said, "before your father figures out that a rainstorm doesn't stop an analyst." The Cleveland downpour had settled into a heavy, relentless sheet of moving gray by the time Aunt Evelyn's sedan cleared the West Side commercial district. The interior of the car smelled of old damp vinyl, cold wool, and the sharp, chemical tang of the defrosting vents struggling against our breath. Evelyn held the steering wheel with both hands, her posture locked straight, her jaw set into the rigid line of a woman who had spent 30 years watching municipal systems fail from the inside. She drove with a deliberate, hyper-focused slowness. A single traffic violation would give my father the exact bureaucratic window he needed to finalize our legal destruction before the banking hours opened. I sat in the passenger seat, my briefcase resting flat across my knees. Inside, the heavy 2-inch manila folder pressed against my lower ribs like a physical weight. My hand stayed loose and perfectly still on the leather latch. In the backseat, the silence was different. It was the shallow, defensive breathing of a hostage who hadn't realized the door was unlocked. Leo hadn't spoken since he closed the rear door. He sat with his canvas backpack pulled tightly against his chest, staring out the side window at the rain-slicked concrete of the strip malls passing by in a blur of neon and wet ash. My phone delivered a double vibration against my thigh inside my trench coat pocket. I didn't pull it out. The family network was a closed circuit. When one node went dark, the remaining wires hummed with frantic, reactionary energy. "He won't use the warehouse general counsel for this," Evelyn said, her voice cutting through the mechanical slap of the wiper blades. She didn't turn her head. "If Arthur goes to the company lawyers, the corporate board has to log the dispute. He can't risk an internal discovery process while the bank's automated compliance queue is tracking the Vanguard account. He'll use Vance's private chambers," I said. My voice was low, holding the flat baseline of a radio log. "Then he has to find a courier who doesn't ask questions about a missing docket number," she muttered, turning the wheel slowly as we approached the stone gates of the Donovan estate. The change in the spatial environment was sharp enough to feel like an impact. We left the cracked asphalt and industrial roofing of the flats behind, entering the manicured, sterile quiet of the eastern suburbs. Here, wealth was an architectural performance. The lawns were perfectly uniform, masked by high limestone walls and weeping willows that sagged under the weight of the freezing water. 2 massive commercial Ford flatbeds, each bearing the gold leaf logo of Donovan Development's masonry division, were parked idling across the entrance of the circular driveway. Their heavy diesel exhaust plumes rose into the gray rain, thick and oily. The drivers sat behind the wheels, their profiles dark against the glass, their faces set in the frustrated grimace of working men who had been pulled off a job site because the money system had suddenly failed beneath them. Evelyn brought the sedan to a crawl at the edge of the curb. Through the blurred passenger window, I saw Leo's silhouette. He was standing under the small cedar overhang of the detached garage, his gray hoodie already soaked through to a dark, heavy charcoal color. He looked incredibly small against the concrete blocks of the bay doors. Beside his boots sat a single, waterlogged cardboard box, its base splitting under the weight of the clothes inside. The white edge of our childhood photo album was visible through the wet tear in the paper. Before I could open my door, the side entrance of the main house clicked open with a sharp, mechanical percussion. My father walked out onto the wet driveway. He was barefoot, his face flush with a dangerous, dark crimson color that contrasted violently with his crisp white linen shirt. His right hand was wrapped tightly around Leo's silver keyring, the keys jingling as he shook his fist through the rain. "Get back inside the garage, Leo," Arthur roared. His voice was a heavy, theatrical boom that easily carried across the asphalt to where his subcontractors sat watching from their cabs. "You don't take one step toward that vehicle. You stay exactly where you are." Leo frozen, his work boots catching on the slick lip of the concrete overhang. The old loop of childhood survival held him fast. My mother, Eleanor, appeared directly behind Arthur in the open doorway, her silk robe immaculate, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her eyes tracking my door with a cold, predatory sharpness. "Valerie," Eleanor called out, her voice carrying a calculated, tragic despair designed entirely for the benefit of the watching workmen. "You have caused enough damage to this family. Look at what you're doing to your brother's future." Aunt Evelyn didn't hesitate. She rolled her driver's side window down exactly 3 inches, just enough for her professional, courtroom-trained voice to pierce the downpour. "Arthur, Eleanor, lower your voices immediately. Every house on this block has digital security cameras with directional microphones. Unless you want your commercial vendor disputes entered into the public neighborhood record before the 9:00 a.m. court docket, you will stand away from that boy." Arthur's expression shifted instantly. It wasn't a look of moral realization. It was the panicked reassessment of an entrepreneur who had just been reminded that there might be unerasable witnesses to his performance. I opened my door and stepped out into the rain. The freezing water hit my face, sharp and immediate, washing away the last remnants of my exhaustion. I walked to the rear of the sedan, my boots splashing through the pooling water, and looked across the wet driveway at my father. "Give him his keys, Arthur," I said, my voice quiet, carrying the flat weight of an officer at a checkpoint. Arthur let out a harsh, barking laugh, tossing the silver key ring lightly in his palm. "You don't give the orders here anymore, Valerie. This vehicle is under my corporate insurance policy. The loan might be in his name, but the infrastructure belongs to me." "I checked the corporate filing before we left the house, Dad," I replied, using the title like a cold weapon. "The vehicle loan is tied exclusively to Leo's personal credit profile, a profile you forced him to open to maximize your write-offs. You are holding personal property under threat of commercial retaliation. That is the statutory definition of coercion in the state of Ohio, and your crew is watching you do it." Arthur's teeth ground together as the legal terminology hit him in front of his subcontractors. He turned his rage directly onto Leo. "Go ahead then, step into that car, Leo, choose her. But the second you get into that backseat, don't you ever come crawling back to this house when she gets tired of playing the savior." Leo flinched. For 2 seconds, nobody moved. The rain hammered against the split cardboard box, the water logging the edges until the seams dissolved entirely, exposing the childhood photo album to the wet pavement. Then my brother bent down with a slow, deliberate dignity, picked up the wet box by its base, and walked directly past our father. He didn't look at him. He opened the rear door of Evelyn's car and slid into the seat, placing the leaking box carefully across his knees. Arthur stood in the rain, his bare feet sinking slightly into the wet lawn, his face turning a dark, dangerous purple. He threw the silver key ring hard against the concrete driveway, the metal clattering against the rim of our tire. "You're nothing without this business, Valerie," he screamed through the downpour as Evelyn shifted the sedan into drive. "You hear me? Both of you are nothing." Eleanor started to cry then, a loud, theatrical sob designed for the flatbeds at the curb. "After everything we sacrificed for you," she wailed. I looked back through the rain-slicked glass as the gates of the estate shrank into the gray background. "Was it sacrifice, Mom?" I whispered into the cold pain, or was it just control with better branding? In the backseat, Leo didn't look back once. He just held the damp photo album on his lap, his knuckles white against the torn cover. The heavy bond paper felt unnaturally thick between my fingers. I sat at Aunt Evelyn's kitchen table, the early evening light casting long, clinical shadows across the scarred oak wood. The white ceramic bowl of oranges sat completely untouched, the sharp scent of citrus still lingering in the cold air, a sensory ghost from the night before. Beside it lay the plastic sleeve the courier had handed me. I looked down at the bold, unembossed header at the top of the page. In the Common Pleas Court of Cuyahoj County, Ohio Emergency Civil Injunction and XPARTE cease and desist order. The text was a clinical assault. It officially accused me of intentional interference with commercial relations, corporate sabotage, and cyberconversion of financial assets. But my eyes didn't linger on the accusations. They went straight to the bottom of the 4th page. A sharp, sweeping flourish in black ink, Judge Harrison Vance presiding. I didn't flinch. My heart rate stayed flat, locking into the steady, mechanical rhythm I used during tactical radio checks outside Kandahar. When the enemy coordinates a sudden, massive mortar strike without establishing a forward observation post, it isn't an exhibition of power. It's a desperate attempt to suppress a threat they didn't see coming. "Evelyn," I said. My voice was low, carrying the quiet, deliberate drone of a log entry. "Look at the top right margin." Evelyn set her tea mug down with a soft click, pulled her reading glasses down her nose, and leaned over the paper. "There's no electronic timestamp from the county clerk," she whispered. "There's no civil case docket number assigned to this action pool. Harrison Vance didn't enter this into the public system, Valerie." "Because he's running out of time," I said. I leaned back into the chair, my mind moving forensically through the metadata of the transaction logs we had pulled earlier. The moment I flagged those frozen lines of credit as a primary guarantor dispute, the banking system's internal fraud division automatically initiated a suspicious activity report. If those lines stayed frozen through the weekend, the bank's federal underwriters would manually pull the transaction history for the Vanguard account. They would see the cash withdrawals matching Vance's luxury resort stays. They would see the exact pipeline Arthur used to purchase his municipal concrete contracts. This injunction wasn't a legitimate legal directive. It was a frantic administrative wall designed to terrify me into entering the administrative portal and unfreezing the lines. Leo walked into the kitchen from the small guest room, his shoulders still slightly hunched from the defensive posture he had carried out of our father's house. He looked at the gold-sealed document on the table, his hand tightening over the back of an oak chair. "What happens if you don't unfreeze them, Val? Can Vance send the sheriff's deputies here?" "No," I said, my gaze resting on the white bowl of oranges. "He can't send a deputy to enforce a document that doesn't exist on the county docket." The internal static of the old family dynamic tried to spark inside my head, the phantom sensation of my mother's voice telling me to just comply, to let the system breathe so Arthur could save his face in front of his crew. But the memory faded into the reality of the paper before me. I opened a fresh, unformatted text file on my terminal. I didn't draft an emotional response. I used my licensed professional credentials to write a formal, non-negotiable legal demand for adjudication under Ohio Commercial Code Section 1304. I addressed the file directly to Arthur Donovan, Eleanor Donovan, and the General Counsel of Donovan Development. Then, I carbon-copied the official administrative email office of Judge Harrison Vance. I typed out the location, the time, Friday at 5:00 p.m. at the warehouse headquarters, and the specific demand for a formal release of my personal guarantee under recorded notice. I didn't use clichés or motivational language. I used data. I gave them a choice: a formal, recorded audit in the warehouse boardroom, or the immediate transmission of the Vanguard Tri-State Evidence folder to the Regional Compliance Branch of the FDIC at 9:00 a.m. Monday morning. I hit the send command at precisely 6:30 p.m. The response took exactly 47 seconds to flash back onto my screen. A single line sent from my father's private mobile device, stripped of its usual corporate signature. "Come alone. Bring the encryption keys to unfreeze the cards. We will settle this as a family." Aunt Evelyn let out a short, sharp laugh from the counter, setting her glasses down on the wood table. "Absolutely not. 'Come alone' is the phrase men use when they know their logic cannot survive the presence of an objective witness. I'll be sitting in the sedan 20 feet from that warehouse office window with duplicate hard copies of every transaction ledger we've saved on the local drive. "I'm going inside with you, Val," Leo said. His voice was quiet, but it held a hard, protective edge. "He thinks he can still use his sheer physical size and his noise to make you freeze up. He needs to see that the old layout of this family is dead." I looked at my brother, seeing his hands stay loose and steady at his sides. Arthur was walking into his own warehouse office, believing he was a king, expecting a formal surrender. He had absolutely no idea he was walking directly into a forensic audit. The email stayed open on my screen, the single line from my father reflecting off the polished kitchen table. "Come alone." It was 47 seconds old. I didn't type a reply. I simply closed the laptop lid, the mechanical click of the latch sounding loud in the small room. The silence that followed was long and deliberate. Through the window, the rain had finally begun to taper off, leaving the west side Cleveland streets wrapped in a heavy, industrial fog. The sky was changing to a bruised, sulfurous purple. "He's not checking his logistics," Aunt Evelyn said from the stove. She didn't look back at me. She poured the hot water into a white ceramic teapot, the steam obscuring her reading glasses for a second. I stood up, my joints stiff from the hours spent tracking hexadecimal transaction strings. I walked to the counter and picked up the heavy, 2-inch thick manila expansion folder. The cardboard was rough against my fingers, secured by a thick, red rubber band that had begun to lose its elasticity. Inside this folder lay the entire unvarnished history of Donovan Development's shadow economy. It wasn't an emotional argument. It was a cold map of public corruption. He wants the encryption keys because without them, he can't release the masonry shipments for the Miller High School project by Monday morning, I said. The City Infrastructure Committee has already paused the contract billing cycles due to the automated fraud alert. Leo stepped into the kitchen, his boots tracking a faint smear of damp mud from the porch across the linoleum. He had changed out of his soaked gray hoodie into a clean denim jacket. He didn't look like the panicked kid who had been hiding behind the tile pallets 12 hours ago. He looked like an adult who had finally looked at the foundation of his house and realized it was made of sand. "The warehouse gates will be locked by 5, Leo said, his eyes resting on the manila folder. "He'll have the interior office doors shut so the yard crew can't hear the argument." I walked into the small hallway and pulled my trench coat from the brass peg. The fabric was still damp from the downpour at the estate, smelling faintly of cold rain and wet wool. As I slid my arms into the sleeves, my hand automatically reached into the interior breast pocket to check the weight of the digital recorder. It was a high-fidelity unit, smaller than a deck of cards. A secondary recorder sat active in the false bottom of my leather briefcase. In the military intelligence wings, they teach you that an audit isn't a conversation. You don't enter the room to negotiate with a target who is using a fraudulent ledger. You enter to establish the boundary where their fiction intersects with the state's penalty guidelines. "I'm driving," Evelyn said, walking past me with her car keys jingling softly in her hand. She had traded her greenhouse sweater for a structured tweed coat. "We'll park the sedan 20 feet from the primary warehouse glass window. If Arthur tries to pull the blinds or extend the meeting past 50 minutes, Leo drops the duplicate evidence file directly into the courier box at the municipal building." Leo didn't ask if I was afraid. He simply reached down, picked up my leather briefcase by its brass handle, and opened the front door. The cold, sulfurous fog hit my face the moment I stepped onto the concrete porch. The smell of wet asphalt, river silt, and the heavy, metallic reek of diesel exhaust from the nearby Tulan dye shop filled the air. This was the raw ground where the infrastructure actually ran. The space where working men broke their hands to maintain the wealth Arthur had spent 2 years logging as his personal luxury reserve. I turned the collar of my trench coat up against the damp mist, looking toward the distant silhouette of the Cleveland Flats. The validation gap was still there. But as I slid into the passenger seat of Evelyn's sedan and heard the engine engage with a low, mechanical rumble, I knew the space was finally closing. Arthur Donovan was sitting behind his mahogany desk, believing he was a king, preparing to receive a formal surrender from a broken daughter. He had absolutely no idea he was walking directly into a forensic audit. The sulfurous river fog hung low over the gravel lot of Donovan Development, thick enough to blur the outlines of the parked flatbeds. The air tasted of wet rust and industrial diesel. Leo and I walked past the row of silent concrete mixers toward the small, glass-fronted warehouse office. Our boots made a sharp, rhythmic crunch on the loose stones. Through the mist, I could see Aunt Evelyn's sedan parked 20 feet from the glass window, her engine idling with a low, metallic hum. The heavy manila folder sat visibly on her dashboard. Inside my trench coat, the digital recorder pressed against my chest, its hidden green indicator light running silently. I carried the leather briefcase in my left hand. I pushed the heavy aluminum door open. The interior of the office was exactly as I remembered it from my childhood, a space constructed to project blue-collar ambition. It smelled of old blueprint ink, commercial floor wax, and the expensive leather of my father's high-backed desk chair. Arthur Donovan sat behind his massive mahogany desk like a magistrate expecting a routine corporate surrender. His silver hair was perfectly aligned, his tie straight, but the skin beneath his eyes was tight, gray, and flat. My mother, Eleanor, stood directly beside his right shoulder. Her hands were clasped over her designer purse with a white-knuckled intensity. Arthur didn't say hello. He didn't offer us a seat. He simply slammed his palm flat against the mahogany desk, making the glass coffee mug jump. "Unlock the cards, Valerie," he said. His voice was a low, controlled roar that filled the small room. "Right now." I walked forward until I reached the edge of the desk. The heels of my boots made a clean, deliberate click on the linoleum. I placed the briefcase flat on the wood, popped the brass latches with a single metallic snap, and pulled out the 2-inch thick manila folder. I slid it across his clean blotter. "No," I said. Arthur's face darkened, the thick vein on his right temple beginning to thrum violently. "The lines are frozen because they are legally anchored to my personal profile and my bookkeeping license," I said. "I am here to balance the accounts." Eleanor took a sharp step forward, her fingers clutching the pearls at her throat. "How dare you speak to your father like he's a common criminal? You gave me an invisible invoice, Mom," I said quietly. "Then you charged me rent in absolute obedience." I reached into the folder and began sliding the cross-referenced ledger sheets forward, one by one. I used my pen to point to the numbers. "This is the statement showing a $10,000 luxury casino hotel charge flagged as lumber supply. This is your private salon membership, Mom." Arthur stood up so fast his leather chair crashed backward against the drywall with a dull thud. "Pick those papers up," he shouted. "You built debt," I said, keeping my hands resting flat on the edge of the desk. "I maintain the illusion, and the illusion is finished." Arthur's eyes flicked instinctively toward the glass window. Outside in the warehouse bay, 2 of his junior project managers were standing near a pallet of insulation, pretending to check inventory while listening. "You think you have power because you can click a button on a computer. I just had a conversation with Judge Vance in chambers." The internal static of my childhood tried to spark. I let his threat hang in the sterile air for 3 long seconds, letting the digital recorders capture the exact frequency of his panic. "Call him," I said. Arthur blinked, his mouth opening slightly. Because the automated fraud audit I triggered when I froze those cards didn't just stop at the bank. The silence that hit the room was absolute. Arthur's face transitioned from a deep, aggressive purple to a hollow, bloodless gray. "Valerie," Eleanor whispered, her performance breaking down into a real, unscripted panic as she reached out to touch the documents. "No," Leo's voice cut through the room. My brother stood near the door, his hands no longer shaking, his chin up. "You don't want family, Dad. You want access." Arthur reached for his phone, his fingers fumbling against the glass screen as he tried to call Vance's private line. I tapped the breast pocket of my trench coat. "This conversation has been recorded under prior written notice, Arthur." Arthur stopped. His hand hovered over the phone, his fingers trembling. Fear looks entirely different on people who are only used to causing it. I gathered the scattered documents, placed them smoothly back inside the manila folder, and zipped my briefcase closed. As Leo and I turned our backs and walked toward the exit, my father's voice came from behind us, hollow, quiet, completely stripped of all its theatrical thunder. I paused at the door, but I didn't turn around to look at the wreckage. "No," I said into the glass, "I'll recover from it." The fallout did not arrive with a dramatic police siren or a sudden courtroom explosion. It arrived like the steady, methodical delivery of the morning mail. One notification, one administrative denial, one canceled order at a time. Over the next 4 weeks, Aunt Evelyn's dining room table remained our dedicated command center. The oak wood still smelled faintly of lemon oil and old newsprint, but the white ceramic bowl of oranges had been pushed aside to make room for stacks of bank dispute affidavits, credit bureau disclosures, and college transfer applications. Leo and I sat side by side for hours under the low amber glow of the floor lamp. The house was quiet. The constant, aggressive thrumming of my phone had finally ceased, replaced by the clinical clack of keys as we rebuilt our financial architecture from the ground up. We had completely severed our digital identities from the Donovan estate. Every password I had ever shared was systematically changed. Leo opened a fresh checking account at a different regional branch, entirely separate from the corporate banking network that Arthur controlled. The structural collapse of my father's empire happened in precise, downstream stages. True to our calculations, the moment Judge Harrison Vance realized that the Vanguard Tri-State Trail was exposed on a recorded line, his institutional self-preservation instinct overrode his country club loyalty. Within 48 hours of the warehouse audit, Vance quietly rescinded the undocketed civil injunction, filed a formal recusal from all municipal infrastructure oversight committees, and blocked Arthur's private mobile number. Deprived of his judicial shield, my father was left entirely exposed to the raw commercial market. By the second week, the bank completed its formal compliance review of the frozen lines. Based on the forensic affidavit and the original guarantor contracts I had submitted, the underwriters permanently downgraded Donovan Development's credit rating. The master lines were dismantled. Two major local suppliers immediately switched the company to strict cash-only terms, refusing to release raw materials without upfront liquidation. Because Arthur couldn't release the necessary concrete and steel shipments on credit, the dominoes hit the field. The City Infrastructure Committee officially canceled the Miller High School renovation contract, citing a material breach of project timelines. 3 days later, two of Arthur's senior job site foremen quit, taking their framing crews with them to a commercial competitor on the south side of the city. The infrastructure was coming apart, piece by piece, because the human life raft had stepped out of the pool. My mother called me once from an unrecognized burner number at 2:14 in the morning. I answered by mistake, my thumb hitting the glass interface before my mind was fully awake. The guest room was dark, the cold silhouette of the West Side strip malls visible through the window blinds. My body automatically braced for a defensive strike, my chest tightening as I sat up on Evelyn's pull-out sofa. "Valerie," Eleanor whispered. Her voice didn't carry its usual theatrical maternal sharpness. It sounded smaller, older, and more brittle than I had ever heard it. "Your father hasn't slept in 6 days. He's sitting in the kitchen with the yard lights on, just staring at the trucks. The bank is reviewing the commercial lease on the primary warehouse, Valerie. They're going to take the property." I closed my eyes, leaning my head back against the cold drywall. The old, conditioned response tried to spark beneath my ribs, the childhood loop that told me to clean up the mess, to absorb the corporate damage so my mother would stop crying. I could taste the gritty, alkaline concrete dust of Kandahar on the back of my throat, a sensory ghost reminding me of what happens when you spend too much time managing fires you didn't start. I looked at the closed door of the guest room, knowing Leo was asleep on the other side, his shoulders finally unclinched for the first time in his adult life. "I'm sorry you're dealing with that, Mom," I said, "but I am no longer your insurance policy." "So that's it," she whispered. "You're just going to sit there and let us lose the warehouse." "No," I said, looking at the pale moonlight cutting through the blinds. "This is just the first boundary." I hung up before she could start the next paragraph of the script. I turned the phone face down on the nightstand and lay back down in the quiet room. My hands were loose and perfectly still on the blanket. The field was burning on the east side of the city, but the smoke didn't reach my eyes anymore. The morning sun finally broke through the permanent, industrial gray baseline of the Cleveland sky, casting a clean, amber light across Aunt Evelyn's kitchen table. The house was completely quiet. It was a safe, profound silence, no longer the tense, suffocating pause that settles over a room right before a domestic explosion. Leo sat across from me, a heavy ceramic mug of black coffee steaming beside his new laptop. The dark denim jacket he wore was unbuttoned, his posture entirely dropped, his face relaxed as his fingers moved across the keyboard. The day before, Evelyn had helped him secure replacement copies of his birth certificate and social security card from the state records office, because Eleanor had locked the originals in the estate safe and refused to hand them over. We were learning that freedom isn't always a loud, theatrical confrontation. Sometimes, it is just a clean spreadsheet with your own name at the top of the column. My father never apologized. 2 days ago, a single email arrived from his private mobile device, written in the stiff, detached format of a formal corporate memo. He stated he was willing to discuss mutual errors in administrative judgment if the pending credit bureau disputes were withdrawn. I didn't type a reply. I simply hovered my cursor over the message and hit delete. My mother mailed Leo a generic birthday card with no return address listed on the white envelope. Inside, beneath the pre-printed greeting, she had written a single line in her elegant, looping script: "We miss the old you." Leo read it twice, his eyes tracking the ink, then placed it quietly into his bottom desk drawer. "They don't miss me, Val," he said, looking out the window at the west side traffic lights. "They just miss the scared part." I watched him close the drawer. That was the exact moment I knew he was going to be functional. Not untouched, not unscarred by the structural rot of our childhood, but independent. Donovan Development survived the audit, but the business was forced permanently downscale. Stripped of his judicial shield and cut off from Vance's backroom network, Arthur had to sell 2 of his commercial flatbeds and liquidate his inventory of premium stone samples just to stay solvent. He was taking small, residential garage extensions now, paying cash up front for lumber and mixing his own concrete on site instead of managing multi-million-dollar municipal contracts. Eleanor sold her luxury vehicle to cover the remaining vendor balances on the fuel cards, replacing it with a dented domestic sedan. For decades, my father had taught his children that consequences were a weapon used to punish disobedience. Now, he was learning that adults face them for dishonesty. I did not celebrate when I heard about the warehouse downsize. I had spent years believing that revenge would feel like fireworks outside the bunker, a sharp, cinematic victory that would instantly erase the years of invisible labor. Instead, it felt like standing at the very edge of a burned, black field, glad the fire had finally ran out of fuel, even if the lingering smoke still made my eyes sting when the wind shifted. I still work the fraud analysis shift at the credit union, tracking the subterranean movement of dirty money through secure networks. But I run my private bookkeeping clients under stricter, more ironclad corporate contracts than ever before. Aunt Evelyn jokes that the family trauma turned me into the most careful woman in Northeast Ohio. She's right. I keep digital copies of everything now: agreements, text logs, boundaries, and promises. Especially promises, because the dirt of Kandahar and the clarity of the ledger have taught me that words are remarkably easy when people are desperate to regain access to your assets. If my parents ever genuinely change their trajectory, I will not keep the door shut simply to punish them. But I will never unlock it just because they knock. There is a fundamental difference between forgiveness and volunteering to act as financial collateral again. There is a difference between being a good daughter and being an unpaid insurance policy for people who only loved you when you absorbed the damage. If you are the one the family calls selfish because you finally stood up in the boardroom and said no, I want you to remember the weight of the paper in your hands. Boundaries do not destroy healthy families. They simply reveal the structural flaws of unhealthy ones. And if your peace of mind costs people their control over your life, that does not mean your peace is wrong. It means their control was never love. My father kicked me out of his house and told me they didn't need me. 20 minutes later, their commercial world stopped working. But the real shock of that night was not that the credit lines froze or that the empire collapsed into the gravel. The real shock was that for the first time in my entire life, I looked at the wreckage of their illusions, turned my back on the estate, and didn't feel a single ounce of guilt. When you strip away the balance sheets, the legal notifications, and the quiet spaces we construct to protect ourselves, a simpler truth remains. Human connection was never meant to be a transaction. True loyalty doesn't require you to compromise your own integrity, nor does real love demand that you sign away your future just to preserve someone else's fragile projection of power. Healthy relationships can withstand the weight of a boundary. In fact, they rely on them. It is only the systems built on control and unvoiced expectations that fracture when a single person chooses to stand firm and say no. There is an old, quiet dignity in reclaiming your own narrative. It means recognizing that you do not owe an unpayable debt of obedience to those who view you merely as utility or collateral. Sometimes, the most profound act of resilience isn't a loud confrontation or a dramatic victory, but the calm, silent refusal to be pulled back into a cycle that broke you. It is the realization that your peace is worth the discomfort of their anger, and that walking away from a toxic dynamic is not an act of selfishness. It is an act of survival. True respect is given freely, built on a foundation of mutual dignity, and it never forces you to disappear in order to keep the room quiet. Thank you so much for listening to this story tonight. If these themes of boundary setting, resilience, and reclaiming your personal truth resonated with you, I would deeply appreciate it if you took a moment to share your thoughts in the comments section below. I love reading how these stories connect with your own lived experiences. To make sure you never miss our next narrative journey, please consider following the page, hitting that subscribe button, and joining our growing community. Your support is what allows this channel to keep telling deeply human stories. Stay safe out there, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next chapter.